scripture reading today is from 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 22 and 23. And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king."
Thank you, Spencer, for reading that. As always, I start off just letting you guys know how grateful I am for the opportunity to present a sermon. And today we're going to do something a little bit different for me. I have an opportunity that's unusual for me, where I'll get the opportunity to preach 4 sermons in a relatively short period of time. And so what we're going to try to do, I'm going to give it my best shot here, is we're going to go through the life of David and try to get that done in 4 sermons. So the whole life of David is what I'm going to shoot for. Today we are going to try to look at David's life before he becomes king, and then look at the rest of it the next day. Next opportunity I have to preach. But this morning we're going to look at David's life up until the point where he kind of runs away, spends some time more or less in exile, and then this evening we'll look at the second portion of David's life before he becomes king. And so we need to start, though, in order to understand David's life at all and why David becomes such a figure for the people of Israel, we need to understand a little bit about what happened with Saul. And so I thank Spencer for reading that passage in chapter 15, where Samuel says to Saul, "Because you have disobeyed God, you have rejected God, God is rejecting you." All right? And so if God has rejected Saul as king, what is going to come next becomes the issue. And so if you turn in your Bibles, and you're in your Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Samuel all morning. We aren't going to go anywhere else. If we look at just right off the bat, verse 16, or chapter 16, verse 1, it says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you grieve over Saul? Since I have rejected him from being king over Israel, fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons.'" And so this is how we're going to jump into David's life. We're going to look at David being chosen as the successor to the kingdom. And so as we look at this morning, I'm just going to let you know up front, there's going to be sections that we read a little bit about, and then we're going to skip a little bit. There's going to be some things that like for instance, we're going to talk about David and Goliath, but we're not going to read a whole lot about it. There's going to be sections that as we read, that we'll just barely brush past. Now, I want to forewarn you of that, so that you may know, hey, this is something that I can spend time catching up on the details. Because if we were to go through the details of each of these stories, it would be a significantly longer sermon series. And so I just wanted you to be aware of that to begin with. One of the other things that I wanted you to be aware of from the start, as we look at David's life, I believe there's lessons that we can learn from it. But usually whenever I get the opportunity to preach, I try to tie in, passages from the New Testament that kind of also illustrate the point and that kind of thing. And I don't plan on doing that this time. So we're going to look at 1 Samuel, and we're going to read these stories. We're going to go through it. We're going to try to understand the life of David a little bit better. And in that, we're going to see how God interacts with different people in different ways. We're going to see some of the characteristics of God and what God expects. And I think we can pull some application for ourselves out of that. And so that's going to be where we're going. And so we're going to start off with this story of David being anointed king. And so, like I said in verse 1, David talking to, or God talking to Samuel says, hey, I've selected someone else. You're going to go and you're going to see it. And so in the story, so he's going to go, Samuel picks up and he goes to Bethlehem. In verse 4, it's a very interesting deal. It says, Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, do you come peaceably? And he said, peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. It's one of those things where I'd read it before. I thought, that's odd, but never really thought why. Okay, so Samuel the prophet comes, and as he comes, the elders come out to meet him, and they are trembling. They are afraid. Have you come here peaceably? An odd question. Right? It's an odd question until we think about what happens at the end of chapter 15 with the whole scenario that got Saul in trouble in the first place. You see, Saul was commanded by God to go and to destroy this king and all of the people. Utterly destroy these people. And what Saul had done was when he'd gone and he'd been given the victory in the battle, he didn't do what he was supposed to do, and he'd left a man alive, Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And that is why Samuel came and said, Saul, you have rejected God, and God has rejected you. And then what happens at the end of chapter 15 is a little bit gory, but I think it's important for us to understand, because if we're going to understand why the elders of this town come out to meet him terrified, perhaps this is it. And then Samuel said, verse 32 of chapter 15, then Samuel said, bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death has passed. And Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Samuel's what I like to call a hands-on kind of guy. Right? God had commanded that this man be destroyed, utterly destroyed. And when Saul didn't take care of it, Saul didn't do what God had said, Samuel says, I'm going to go ahead and do what's supposed to have happened here. And so, if you had heard about what Samuel had done, and he comes to your town, I can see why you might be a little nervous. What's he here to do? Which one of us messed up, right? Is this same type of judgment come upon us? And so he reassures him. He says, hey, this is what we're going to do. I've come peacefully. We're going to make a sacrifice. Consecrate yourselves. And I think most of us are familiar with the story, so we're not going to read all of it. We're not going to delve into all of it. But what we see here, and one of the points that I think is worth looking at is beginning in verse 6 of chapter 16. It says, when they came, he looked on Eliab, and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. We see here that Samuel, when the first son, the oldest son, is brought before him, whatever may be, the son is evidently impressive physically. Right? Tall, strong dude, type of dude that you look at and go, that might be the next king, right? Remember when Saul is announced as king, when Saul is chosen as king, that he's described as being taller than everyone else. The head length, I believe, is what the description is, taller than everyone else. Being intimidating, being able to take care of yourself, that was an important aspect of getting the respect of the people. And so Samuel sees this as, oh, in his mind, this is the dude. And God says, no. Don't look on the outward appearance. That is not my main concern. All right? And so, real brief, not going to go into it super deep. I think that point is pretty obvious here. if we're going to take an application from that, an understanding of who God is and how God treats us and how God views humanity, real simple lesson is that we should be careful about making judgments on people just based off of their appearance. Should be careful about that. Don't be so quick to judge someone just based off of their appearance. It says here, God judged based off of what was on the inside. God based his judgment on the heart. Anyways, as we go through the story, again, I'm just going to go through it, skip some of it, tell you what happens, right? The rest of Jesse's sons, the rest of these sons walk through. None of them are selected. He says, okay, well, there's got to be someone else. Do you have another son? And he says, yeah, my youngest son is in he's taking care of the sheep. In verse 12 at the end, and he sent and he brought him in, and now he was a ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. And so David is selected. David is anointed. All right, so this is the kind of entrance of David into the scene. All right, he's called out from the pasture where he's at with the sheep. And he is selected. He is anointed. The oil is poured upon him. Samuel says, this is going to be the one who's been anointed by God. The second half of chapter 16 is where it gets kind of interesting in terms of controversy about the way that people view this. Because as we look at the second half of chapter 16 and then going into chapter 17 where we have David and Goliath in that story, one of the things that seems kind of odd as you read the story of David and Goliath, it appears at the very end of that chapter that Saul does not know who David is. At least that is one potential reading of the way that, as you read that story, there's one potential way. But at the end of chapter 16, David is sent into Saul's household to serve him. Serves him by playing an instrument and keeping a man at peace. And so people look at this and they say, well, what is this? Does Saul know him? Does Saul not know him? And so I think it's interesting and it's worthwhile talking about if we're going to study the story of David and we're going to look at this life real quickly to go through, okay, what are some potential options for how we handle this as Christians? We look at the story and we say, well, what makes most sense? One of the first things that we have to acknowledge as a possibility is that when ancient writers wrote, they did not always put things into a chronological order. They might change the order of things as they write it down to serve whatever purpose it is that they might be serving. Right? They might be trying to make a point. And what I'm trying to say is the chronological order of things was not as important to them as it would be to us today if we were to write a history. And when we look at chapter 17, I'll show you a verse that that we can see as an example of that, where it tells us something out of order. Right? This thing happens, but we know this thing must happen later than where it's at in that passage. So we'll look at that. That's one possibility. One possibility is that David is not called to serve Saul in this way until after David and Goliath, and that for whatever reason the author put this in front of it. That's one option. All right. Another option that is out there, David is described as a young man. Right. That is one of the big points of the David and Goliath story. He's a young man. And so we will see in chapter 17 that one of the things that happens is that David would occasionally go back and forth between Saul and his father's flocks. Right? And depending upon the length of time between David being with Saul and him going out to the flocks and then coming back, if David is a young man, there's a significant chance that physically he changed quite a bit. Right? You don't have to think too hard about some of the teenagers and stuff that are in our presence that have gone through our congregation. Some who are here this morning as college students or people who've even gone through college, and you can think back and go, you know what? There was a time where, man, their appearance changed so drastically, so quickly. That happens. That's one option. That's what some people think. Maybe that's the explanation for why he doesn't immediately recognize David for being who he is. And the other option, and I will freely admit this is the one that I think makes the most sense, that seems most logical to me, is that when David is fighting Goliath, one of the key points is when he shows up, he says, what's going to happen to the person who defeats Goliath? And one of the responses we'll see is that their household, their family will be free. An explanation for what it means to be free might be that their household doesn't have to pay taxes. And so at the end of chapter 17, when it appears that Saul doesn't know who David is, one of the things that we'll look at and we'll see real quickly is that he asked who his family is, who's his father. And so it's possible he recognized David for who David was, but had forgotten who David's father was, right? This, to me, is the one that makes the most sense. That's the way that I look at it and go. Like I said, there's three options. Either way, the point I'm trying to make is that we do not have to look at this and go, oh, contradiction. This didn't happen. There could be several reasons why these orders are the way that they are. But at the end of chapter 16, right, we'll look at a few verses here. At the end of chapter 16, or at verse 18 is what I want to look at because there's a description. So because Saul is having these issues that are going on, he's being tormented. Someone suggests, hey, get someone who's good at playing the lyre. And in verse 18 it says, one of the young men answered, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. So I think it's interesting. Early on, we have this description, someone else describing what is David like, right? At the beginning of chapter 16, when Saul's looking at it, it describes his kind of physical appearance. Here we have a description of his character, right? What's David like? David is he's skillful at playing. He's a man of valor. He's a man of war. He's prudent in speech and a man of good presence. Says the Lord is with him. And so David is already recognized as someone that God has blessed. And then David goes on in verses 21 through 22, and it says, and David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre, and he played it with his hand. And so Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So David in his life, he has been anointed by Samuel. He has been selected to serve Saul. He does well in that, and he even becomes an armor bearer. All right? He becomes someone that Saul respects and serves him in this way. And then in chapter 17, this is the story that most of us know, our little ones know it very well. It's a popular one that we talk about with David and Goliath. And I'm not going to go into all the details on this, right? Suffice it to say, the Philistines gather for war. Really big dude challenges the Israelites and says, hey, challenge me. Winner of the challenge, let's not have everyone come out and fight. It's just one-on-one. Winner of this challenge, their side wins. All right? And you can read chapter 17 if you want the full description of Goliath. Trust me, big guy. Evidently strong dude. Heavily armored. Right? We have that. And then, beginning in verse 12, we see one of the descriptions. This is, again, one of the reasons why I think that the David playing for Saul happened before this event. In verse 12, it says, now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. And in the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went into the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next to him, Abinadab, and the third Shema. And David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And so we are told in the story of David and Goliath that one of the things that David is doing, he's going back and forth between serving Saul and taking care of his father's sheep. Right? And so again, that's the reason why I think the third option of ways that we explain Saul's apparent confusion of who David is makes the most sense to me, because it appears that David has already been traveling back and forth between Saul and his father's sheep. And so he goes on, and he gives a speech that is famous. So we have in verses, 23 through 25, it's important to look at. This is, again, the point of what is going to be done for the person. So as he talked with them, so David has come back, and as he talked with them, behold, champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up from the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And so we see one of the rewards that is given is, again, like we talked about earlier, your household will be free. Right? In other words, your family will not have to pay taxes, as a potential explanation for that. And so David is called before Saul. Verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, and it took the lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and I struck him and I killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Again, as we read this, a couple things that we can notice. First of all, David puts his hope in God. Right? David says, I have been in dangerous situations, and God has been with me. I have killed the lion, I have killed the bear, and God will be with me here. Right? He says, I will defeat this Philistine because God is with me. God is the strength that he relies upon. One of the things I think is interesting to point out, and I think, again, to me, backs up the notion of that Saul knew who David was. If you are the king of Israel, and this giant has come out and belittled your people for 40 days, why would you, even if this person comes and says, look, I've killed a lion and I've killed a bear, say, okay, fine, go ahead. Go, take care of it. It appears to me, it makes sense to me that Saul was already familiar with David. And so when David comes before him, and when David is there, he says, look, I know, yeah, you've already done these things, right? It's been reported to me that you're a man of valor. You're capable, right? You've proven yourself capable. And then, of course, in the story, Saul offers his own armor. And David says, I haven't tested this. I don't know that this would work for me. I can't do that. And you have the story where David kills Goliath. Again, we're not going to get into every bit of it, but we are going to look at, because like I said, one of the explanations is perhaps these events are just told out of order, and I told you I'd share with you an example of it. If you look at verse 54 of chapter 17. And David took the head of the Philistine, and he brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. All right? So in verse 54, it records that David takes the head and takes it to Jerusalem, and he takes the armor to his tent. But obviously, David did not take the head all the way to Jerusalem, then come back with the armor, and then have a conversation with Saul. Right? The author records an event that takes place later and places it here. Right? And so again, multiple explanations, multiple possibilities for why does it seem the way that it does, where perhaps Saul is confused. But we get down to the end of it, and it says, as soon as Saul, in verse 55, as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, his commander of the army, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Okay? So again, the way that I view it, the way that I think makes sense is that Saul's trying to figure out whose family gets this reward. It makes sense to me that perhaps as the king of Israel, you have a lot of things going on and you don't remember the family from which your armor bearer came from. Seems completely reasonable to me. Either way, David kills Goliath, right? Not leaning upon his own strength, but leaning upon the strength of God. David is rewarded by Saul. And David enters into his household, and it says that Saul says, I do not want him to go. So chapter 18, verse 1, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And so after defeating Goliath, David enters Saul's house, it seems, on a permanent basis. It seems that he no longer is going back and forth between his father's fields and Saul. That he is there permanently. And Saul's son Jonathan and David become great friends. Their souls knit together. Seems like a pretty cool way to describe a friendship. Would love to have friendships that are like that, right? Souls are knit together. Interesting thing, and it's going to play an important part because a lot of things happen at a pretty rapid pace. Beginning in verse 5 of chapter 18, it says, and David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul sent him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines and with songs of joy and with musical instruments. And the women sang it to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry. And this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. See, David and Saul's relationships becomes very strained pretty early. And you think about it, Saul, right? He already knows what's coming. He already knows that the kingdom is going to be taken from him. And so when he sees David have the success and he sees these people celebrating David, he becomes very jealous. And he says he eyed him from that point on. What is interesting is that he doesn't immediately kick David out of his service. Right? David's a successful soldier, successful warrior. He doesn't just kick him out, but he eyes him. He keeps his eye on him. And we're going to see this conflict that comes up over and over again. In verse 10 of chapter 18, it says, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, and he had his spear in his hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. I don't know what type of work environment many of you guys have. Maybe you occasionally have to deal with some conflict with your bosses. Doesn't seem like that's an unusual thing. David's job seems a little more dangerous. Right? When the big, strong king grabs a javelin and says, you know what, I'm going to try to pin you to a wall, I'm sure there would be a lot of HR complaints in that department. There's an interesting thing about David, though. David does not leave the service of the king. Don't know about you. I work out at Toyota, build cars. If Toyota tries to drop a car on me, I'm done. I ain't going back. I do not have loyalty to that company, right? Saul throws a javelin at him. Spear. Throws a spear right at him. I'm going to spear this dude to the wall. David does not leave his service. And we're going to see this tonight, too, in particular. Why David doesn't leave his service. And it is because he respects Saul, but it's because he respects Saul because God had anointed Saul. And David will not go against God. And I think it's interesting. Like I said, someone tries to kill me at work, I'm gone. I'm not going back, and yet he doesn't run from him. Continuing in verse 11, or after verse 11, verse 12, it says, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but he departed from Saul. And so Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people, and David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. So Saul's response, I'm afraid of this guy. I don't like his success. I don't like what he's doing. The best thing for me to do is to get him away from me. I'm going to send him out. And we'll see that Saul seems to me, anyways, to have a plan that is kind of turning here. David's going to go fight his enemies. David, go fight your enemies. And he's successful, which I think is probably a good and bad thing for Saul. Right? Saul is glad that David is having success against his enemies, but also Saul is worried because he's having success, and the people respect David because he's having the success. And so David's life becomes more complicated. You'll remember that one of the promises, one of the things that was supposed to happen was that whoever killed Goliath was going to be able to marry one of the daughters of Saul. And so one of the things that happens is that Saul comes up with this plan. He says, I'll let you marry this daughter, and then he marries that daughter off to someone else. He says, okay, I'll let you marry this other daughter, but you have to fulfill this commandment. And so verse 20 of chapter 18 says, now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him, and Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hands of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? And the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. And Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except for 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So Saul comes up with a plan, right? He'd already sent them out to battle several times. David had success. And Saul finds out, well, one of his daughters loves him. Hey, David, here you go, marry. David's response is, look, I'm not worthy of becoming the son-in-law of the king. That's a position of honor. I have not earned that. I don't have the wealth to buy that. I can't pay the cost of this. And Saul says, no, pretty simple. Just go out, kill 100 Philistines, bring me the proof, you can marry my daughter. With the plan being, David's going to fail. Right? That's what Saul wants to happen, right? Saul sends him out hoping that he's going to fail. Of course, David does not fail. And the conflict continues. In chapter 19, we're not going to read a whole lot of it, but in chapter 19, Saul again come up with another plan. I'm going to try to kill David again. And this time, Jonathan hears about the plan. Jonathan convinces Saul, no, don't kill him. And that works for a little bit. David comes back, right? So David runs because Saul's trying to kill him. Jonathan says, whoa, hey, no, don't do it. And David comes back. And then Saul says, well, I'm going to go ahead and kill him. And through a series of events, what we come to at the end of, or in verse 19, or sorry, I've skipped, in chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, we have the second time, or another time in which David is almost pinned by Saul. Let's see, sorry, 9 and 10. Okay. The harmful spirit, so chapter 19, verse 9, the harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So again, David having spears thrown at him as job. This time he runs. This time when he goes home, he finds out that he's got people watching. He's going to kill. And David runs again. He's like, I'm out of here. And David's wife, Saul's daughter, helps him escape, right? And it leads to this point, the last thing that we're going to look at here in chapter 20. This is right before David enters into what I call an exile, where he makes a deal before he does this. Chapter 20, verse 12. Is Jonathan and David. Remember, they're good friends. Their souls are knit together. It said, Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not disclose it to you, and send you away that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. David had entered into the service of the king. The king becomes more and more angry at him. The king's tried to kill him multiple times. And things finally reach a point where David realizes, I cannot be here anymore. And he talks to Jonathan. And remember, Jonathan, right? If this was a normal situation, if the kingdom was going to continue on in Saul's family line, Jonathan is in line to become a king. But Jonathan recognizes that God is with David. God has blessed David. And Jonathan says, may David's enemies be dealt with. Sends him away. Tonight we're going to look at what happens when David is in exile. When we see David, we recognize a few things in his life. He appears to be a man of great valor, he's a good soldier, and a man who trusts God. He's a man who makes great friendships. And here he enters into a covenant, and we'll see this play out. It's important for us to understand this covenant because we'll see this when we look at the events tonight of kind of what goes on in the exile, of how David handles these different situations. Because David's great respect is for the Lord. And he will not go against the Lord. We as Christians ought to have that same attitude. Are we as Christians people of valor? People who are honorable? Do we have the same trust in God that David had? Do we have the same respect for God and his commandments that David had? If you have not put your trust in God, now is a great time to do so. If you had put your faith in God, but you have wandered away, you have at some point rejected God, and need to be brought back into alignment with the will of God. Let us as a congregation help to encourage you. If there is any way that we can help you this morning, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.